Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I hope that you are well. I am going to be joined very shortly by the wonderful Reasoned Answers, who's going to spoil us this evening to an amazing presentation about the death of Muhammad and about what that can teach us about Islam. I hope that you enjoy this. I just want to make it clear to any sort of admin in the chat that if we've got any trolling kind of behavior, do flag it up to me so that I can block or get rid of that person. However, you are fully authorized to silence anyone you feel who's being disruptive, but you just can't remove them. But you can silence them as many times until they get the message. But, you know, try to be gentle with the power that you have and not use it too much. If you like the work that I'm doing, guys, please do subscribe to the channel. It helps. And please do like the video. That also helps as well. Remember, we're fighting against the progressive machine on YouTube. And, you know, if you would like to support the work that I do through my channel and the evangelism that I do and the training that I do around the country in the UK and here in London, then please do consider becoming a Covenant partner. The links are in the description box below. I want to send a shout out to Nadaverse, the lovely Nadaverse, such a great stalwart and pillar of stuff that I've been doing here. I see someone's taking the mick out of Alonzo Harris. That is completely acceptable. And I thoroughly enjoy your handle. Okay, guys, without further ado, I'm going to bring on the amazing Thaddeus. How are we doing, Thaddeus?
Hello. Thank you for having me on today. It's a great day to get to look at Islamic scriptures, look at the death of Muhammad, and contrast this implicitly to what we know about Christianity. Christianity is a historical religion. It's based on historical events. Islam claims to be likewise. But when we look at the history, we find that that is questionable.
Indeed it is. However, before we go any further, it is a custom and a tradition. Just want your opinion, Thaddeus. Do you think this looks better? One second. Do you think we look better like this?
Either's fine.
Or like this? I don't know. I'm really undecided. I've never even thought about it before until just this second. Anyway, I'm going to go with this one because I feel we need a border. Right, bro. As is the custom on this channel, we're going to start in prayer. So if you've got your psalm ready, do you speak any other languages? What's your first language?
So I only speak English.
Okay, so we'll just do it in English then. Brilliant. If you want to read the psalm.
Yep. So I picked Psalm 39. This is commonly used at funerals, so I thought it would be an appropriate psalm for today. I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle, so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me. As I mused, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. O Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Salah. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. O now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. I am mute. Do not open my mouth. For it is you who have done it. Remove your stroke from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sins, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. Salah. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Look away from me, that I may smile again, before I depart and am no more.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Amen.
Right. Shall I get your slides up?
Yep, that would be fine.
Thaddeus, the floor is yours. If we have time at the end, we'll do questions from the audience. However, if I think I need to ask you a question, I'm just going to rudely interrupt your flow and dive straight in with a question that I might have.
Perfect. Okay. Let's do it. So today we're going to be looking at the death of Muhammad from a historical standpoint, trying to separate the myth from the actual history. We're going to look first at the standard narrative, the story that most Muslims believe today, and we'll have a brief aside looking at the famous line of my aorta being cut. Then we'll discover that it's not really the standard narrative, but rather the standard narratives, that there are multiple different accepted stories of the death of Muhammad, even within Islamic tradition. After that, we're going to look at what non-Islamic historical texts tell us about the death of Muhammad. And we'll ask the question, are these more or less reliable than the Islamic sources? Can we trust what they tell us? Then we're going to look at Christian polemical sources. We're going to look at the arguments early Christians were using against early Muslims, saying that your religion is false because of the way Muhammad died. And then we'll ask the question, why should we trust these sources? Are these sources reliable? Should they just be discarded because Christians were just saying whatever they wanted to say to make Muhammad look bad? And then finally, we're going to put it all together, try to create a reconstruction of what really happened, and answer the question what this means for the truth of Islam. We'll start with the standard narrative. I pulled this from an article called The Death of the Messenger of Allah, posted on Sunnah Online, because I wanted to make sure to get all the details that Muslims would agree to and not just go based on my own impression.
So this is an Islamic source written for Muslims?
Yes, correct. This is written by Muslims for Muslims. And I'll summarize it here. The exact URL is at the bottom of the screen. My sources throughout will be at the bottom of the screen. So feel free to check up on anything I say. So they write that about 2 weeks before he died, Muhammad became ill. 5 days before his death, his temperature spiked, and Muhammad gave a speech cursing the Jews and the Christians. 4 days before he died, he calls for a writing tablet. Yes, the so-called illiterate Muhammad asks for a tablet to write his final instructions on. For some reason, Umar refuses to bring him a tablet, and then people start arguing with one another whether Muhammad should get the tablet or not. Muhammad ends up giving 3 commands. He says that he gives the command to expel all non-Muslims from Arabia. He gives the command to honor political delegations. And then he gave a 3rd command, which has now been forgotten. Yes, the Muslims who had the perfect memory to transmit the Quran and all the Hadith to us couldn't be bothered to remember what the 3rd of the 3 final commands of Muhammad was. After this, Muhammad was too weak to walk around and lead prayers, so Abu Bakr took over the responsibility of doing that. However, two men did carry the half-dead Muhammad in to lead prayer one last time. No doubt a very inspirational sight to see. The day before he dies, Muhammad sets his slaves free, gives away some money, and mortgages his armor to a Jew for barley for no apparent reason. Then on his last day, which is a Monday, Muhammad tells Fatima that he won't live to see another day and that she would be the next of his family to die. This causes her to laugh, apparently out of joy, at least according to the hadith, because she's so excited that she gets to be the next person to die. Muhammad declares that he is dying from the poison of Kabar. They did leave out a small little detail here, that Muhammad, as he was dying, said, "I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison." We'll get back to that in a second. Muhammad brushes his teeth with some difficulty and washes his face, declaring as one of his final words, "Death is full of agonies." He dies there's some dispute about the exact date, but it was apparently in June 632. Keep that in mind for later when we look at what the other sources say about the death of Muhammad and when it occurred. And he was leaning on Aisha while this happened. Umar doesn't believe that Muhammad is dead. He says that he's going to return after 40 days, that he's only temporarily left his body. Abu Bakr then arrives on the scene and declares that Muhammad is indeed dead. Before the body even hits the floor, a fight breaks out over who will succeed Muhammad as the next caliph. They want to argue about who is going to be in charge of the armies instead of preparing for Muhammad's funeral. As such, they lock his body up in a room while people dispute over that. The next day, Muhammad's body is washed. There is a dispute over whether he should be undressed or left dressed while he's washed. And Aisha later remarks that if she'd known what was going on, she would have washed the body herself, i.e. Aisha has been removed from the scene here. She doesn't know what's going on. Muhammad is wrapped in white sheets. Yet another dispute breaks out, this time over where to bury the body of Muhammad. Muslims come to pay their respects, and finally, the body is buried in the middle of the night, usually said to be Wednesday, and even Aisha didn't know what was going on. So does this sound more or less the same story you've heard, Bob?
I'll be honest. I've never really looked into this topic in any great depth. So I'm as happy to go along with what the sunnaonline.com as you are.
All right.
I mean, this is an Islamic source, an Islamic author writing to an Islamic audience. I know that doesn't make them infallible, but there's very little reason to think that they would be doing tack here at this moment in time, or the typical Dawaganda twisting of the truth.
Fair enough. So I just want to point out a couple observations from this story. And remember, this is the story coming from a Islamic source here. It says that there was lots of disputes, that people kept arguing about what was going on. It says that Aisha died in the arms of Muhammad, but then she's inexplicitly removed from the scene. She just disappears, no explanations given, but she's apparently not there when Muhammad is prepped for burial, and she's not there when he's buried as well. There's an expectation, at least from some Muslims, that Muhammad wasn't really dead and that he would return to life. And the death is linked to Khaybar and Judaism, which just on the surface is highly implausible. People normally don't die of poison years later. So now we have to address this line of my aorta being cut. Not the main topic today by any means, but no discussion of Muhammad's death would be complete without looking at this famous line. In the Quran, 69:46, we read, "And if he," meaning Muhammad, "had made up about us some sayings, we would have seized him by the right hand. Then we would have cut from him the aorta." Compare this to what Muhammad is said to have said, according to Sahih Bukhari, on his death. The Prophet, in his ailment, in which he died, used to say, "O Aisha, I still feel the pain caused by the food I ate at Khaybar, and at this time I feel as if my aorta is being cut from that poison." So Allah declares that if Muhammad's a false prophet, he will die by having his aorta cut, and then Muhammad describes his own death as being like his aorta being cut. Muslims, of course, will offer a couple apologetics or excuses to get around this. The first thing they'll say is that there are two different words being used here. Although they're both translated as aorta, in Arabic it's two different words. Al-Watin in the Quran, Al-Abhar in the Hadith. This is true, but this doesn't really strike me as a very compelling defense. It's common for atheists today to say something like, if God is real and I'm lying, I ask him to strike me by lightning, or something along those lines. Well, imagine this scenario. A famous atheist speaker is giving a talk inside a building. The building is struck by lightning. There's a power surge, and by a freak occurrence, there's a jump from the electrical lines into his body, and he is hit by the electrical charge. And he says, as he's dying, "I feel like I have been hit by a thunderbolt instead of a lightning bolt." Would we then say, "Oh, well, then this is totally meaningless"? He said he was going to be die of lightning if he was speaking falseness, but when he was dying, he said he was struck by thunder. Of course, no one would accept that as an explanation. Now, of course, people would still say, well, it's a coincidence or something like that, but they wouldn't try to argue on it based on linguistics, certainly. They wouldn't say, "Oh, he said a different word, it doesn't count." So then the other explanation they offer is that it's an idiom. At least on the surface, this one sounds a little better to me, that it was just a way of saying I'm dying. To say my aorta is being cut is just a way of saying I'm dying. Therefore, the Quran just says that we would kill Muhammad if he was a false prophet, and Muhammad just says, "I feel as if I'm dying in this exact moment." There are a couple problems, however. First of all, it's undermined by the first defense. An idiom by nature is a statement that has a meaning different than the literal word-by-word meaning would be if it wasn't an idiom. But if it's two different phrases with two different words, then it doesn't seem like it could be an idiom, because an idiom is a specific set of words. It's not just an idea. So we have two different words to describe the same idea, makes an idiom a lot less probable. Then the other problem is that early Arabs didn't seem to know this. That, for example, in his tafsir, Ibn Kathir remarks that it, meaning al-watin, is the heart, its blood, and whatever is it. If this was just an idiom, why is he describing the aorta as being the heart and its blood and whatever is near it? Why doesn't he just say this is an idiom that is commonly used, that just means to die, or not common at all because everyone already knew that it was an idiom? But instead he seems to attribute it to a physical part of the body which clearly is not compatible with it being an idiom. So if Muslims are going to say that this is an idiom, they need to actually demonstrate that, not just assert it. And they need to look at the evidence. They need to explain why Ibn Kathir didn't know it was an idiom. They need to explain why different words are used and somehow it's still an idiom. So let me offer a third explanation for Muslims. They might not like it, but it is a third explanation of how this wouldn't be a indication that Muhammad died as a false prophet, and that's the story is made up. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Was the story of Muhammad's death made up by Muslims who lived hundreds of years after the events actually occurred?
Now, I just before you continue, I take it at some point in this presentation you're going to explain why you think they made it up.
Yes.
Great. So I won't ask that question just yet. Carry on.
So I gave this as the standard narrative, but it's actually, there's different narratives about how Muhammad died. In the main, most popular Shia version of the story, Muhammad is painted completely differently. In the Sunni version, he was kind of not in control of anything. He was overcome by illness. Well, in the Shia version, Muhammad's painted as being in complete control. Gabriel and the angel of death figure prominently. They come and visit him and ask him, "Are you ready to die now?" No one has ever been asked before, but we're going to ask you if it's the right time to take you into paradise. Aisha is nowhere to be found in the story at all consistent with the difference between Sunni and Shia beliefs of the right successors of Muhammad. And instead, Ali is put as the person closest to Muhammad when he dies. And indeed, in some versions of the Shia tale, it is Aisha and Hafsa who poisoned Muhammad. It was not a Jewish person years earlier, but rather it was his wives poisoning him. In addition to the Shia narratives, there are quite a number of other variant traditions that have survived. But you don't have to take my word for it. We can just look at what Islam QA says about the death of Muhammad. They titled their fatwa, "Lengthy Fabricated Hadith About the Death of the Prophet." They write, "It is well known to the scholars that the story of the death of the Prophet is one of the topics concerning which the most lies were told by the liars, and people transmitted to one another many things concerning it that are not proven." In other words, there are many hadith that paint a different picture than the one that has come to be accepted. So they're judged to be lies. They give an example of this. They say Al-Waqidi and others quoted many reports concerning the Prophet's death that contained very strange and weird things. But we rejected most of them because of the weakness of the isnads and the oddness of their texts, especially those that were narrated by many later storytellers and others. So they have rejected these tales because they think they sound odd and based on their isnads. But as we know, the isnads aren't really meaningful because they determine who are liars by what they want to accept to begin with. So it's all kind of a circular logic. Of course, Muslims will say otherwise, but that's the reality of the thing. And shortly, we will see what some of those very strange and weird things found in Muslim sources about the death of Muhammad are. But first, we're going to look at some non-Islamic history texts. We're going to focus on the conquest of the Levant, that is Syria, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. According to the standard narrative, when did this begin? And who led the conquest? Bob, do you recall offhand who is said to lead the conquest?
Oh, I didn't realize this was going to be a quiz, otherwise I would have got my notes out. So it was 632, according to the Islamic standard narrative, that he died. And so the first caliph after him, it's not Uthman, it's, I want to say Abu Bakr.
That's correct.
Did I pass?
Yes, Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr Abu Bakr combined with Umar led the conquest. They led the armies in the conquest of the Levant, and that was said to take place starting in 634, so 2 years after Muhammad died. And then I also want to offer a quick disclaimer on the name Muhammad. I just use it out of convenience. I don't necessarily... it doesn't necessarily matter if that's the literal name of the founder of Islam. You know, people say it might actually be a title, and that's not his literal name. It doesn't really matter here. Even if it's, a fictionalized, legendarized character, I'm just using the name for convenience. The use should not be seen as endorsing the truth of the narrative about Muhammad founding Islam. Now, scholarship, secular scholarship, has largely taken the standard Sunni narrative for granted as representing accurate history, which is really quite strange because this is not the way history is normally done. Normally, scholars take a skeptical approach, and especially when it comes to the foundations of Christianity, they do the exact opposite. They say that the Christian sources are of questionable reliability and try to verify as much as they can from non-Christian sources. But then when it comes to Islam, they say, well, the Islamic sources are good. We can just trust those. We don't need to look at the texts by outsiders. They wouldn't have known what's going on in Islam. So it's really a strange double standard that is taking place here. And this is
Can I
done.
just comment on
Yep.
that, Thaddeus?
Yep,
Because
absolutely.
it is something that I myself have observed, and I think it's basically because there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, the Muslim community is far more willing to engage polemically and apologetically in every sphere of learning to try and advance the cause of Islam, in a way that Christians have long since forgotten how to and probably need to rediscover. But secondly, it's also because if any academic, as some Arab Muslim academics have discovered to their cost, if you ever push the boat out too far academically, you receive the wrath of less educated militants. And I think a lot of the academic world in the West is simply intimidated into not being too critical. And I think fear is creeping into academic truth in Western academia. I'm sorry, I just wanted to
No,
comment on that.
that's a good point, and I would agree with that. As Yasser Qadi put it, there's a red line. We investigate a little bit, but then we get to a line. We're like, nope, we're not going to look any further. We can't look beyond that. We have to stick with what we've been taught.
Yeah.
And for various reasons, fear, academic reasons, they'll be cut off from the sources they need to do their job, for example, that Western academics have largely gone along with this. And this is despite the fact that the biographies of Jesus, or what we call the Gospels, were finalized 30 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. In contrast, the earliest extant biography of Muhammad, that of Ibn Ishaq, or at least largely extant, was written about 125 years after the death of Muhammad, so at least double, perhaps as much as 4 times as long after. But it actually gets much worse for Muslims. 125 years is not necessarily by itself a big problem, but we know that what we call Ibn Ishaq's biography is known from Ibn Hasim's condensed and edited version, that we don't have the original writing, but we have a version of it that comes 200 years after Muhammad. And he even made a comment that he left out some material that he found especially offensive. So it raises questions. What was left out? What didn't he record? And then the canonical hadith and the biographies that Muslims accept, because most Muslims reject Ibn Ishaq as a valid source. They say that he's unreliable, that he didn't do a very good job of writing accurate information. The sources they believe in come in 250 years or more after the death of Muhammad. So we're now looking at a pretty big gap, and even more importantly than the gap, we're looking at sources that have sometimes explicitly been edited to paint a more favorable picture of Muhammad. So we should be consistent. If we're being, responsible academics, we should be consistent and not discard these early non-Islamic texts, these non-Islamic historical texts, unless we have reason to discard a specific text, like that specific text shows that it is unreliable.
Well,
So we're
plus
now
a
going to
historian. Sorry, I can see there's a bit of a lag between us, but there's, that historians would do that. They would take all the evidence and look at all of the material. They didn't just want to look at one part of it. They don't do that with Christianity, so they shouldn't be doing that with anyone else. So, yeah, I just want to underline that point because it's really important.
Yeah, if our interest is truth here, we shouldn't just discard sources unless we have a valid reason to do so. So we're going to look at some of the texts, and in interest of time, I won't be reading through the text, but the words will be up on the screen. I'll just kind of summarize them and maybe pull out a couple key lines just to get the key information. But, feel free to go back later and look at everything the source says to make sure I'm accurately representing what it says. We'll start with the Doctrina Jacobi Nuper Baptizati, which is purported to have been written in July of 634, so just 2 years after the purported death of Muhammad. It argues, the main purpose of the work is to argue that Jews who were forcefully baptized in the year 632 should accept Christianity for real. So it's not even about Islam at all. It was likely written by a Jewish convert to Christianity because of the intimate knowledge they show of Jewish practices, the Jewish community at the time, and this contrasts with Christian sources that often stereotyped the Jewish community and did not accurately represent their beliefs. In addition to that, the source is known to contain unusually accurate history and shows knowledge of the Palestinian geography. So shows knowledge of the region in which the passage that we look at takes place. It mentions the appearance of a new prophet, which is unnamed but is clearly Muhammad. I'll just read a couple key lines. A prophet has appeared, coming with the Saracens, and he is preaching the arrival of the anointed one who is to come, the Messiah. An old man then speaks and says that this prophet is false, and that he fears that the Jews have rejected the true Messiah, the one who came in the first century, and instead are about to accept the Antichrist as their Messiah. But he tells this other figure, Abraham, to go and investigate what is going on to see if he is indeed a false prophet, as he suspects he might be. Abraham investigates and then says, I heard from those who had met him being Muhammad, that one will find no truth in the so-called prophet, only the shedding of human blood. In fact, he says that he has the keys of paradise, which is impossible. A few key takeaways from this. The verb tenses in this phrase, coming with, suggest that it is roughly contemporary with the events that it's describing, that this is written from first-hand knowledge, second-hand knowledge. The Jewish expectation is that Muhammad will liberate them from the hated Rome via the conquest. And we're going to see more on that in later sources as well. Again, the purpose of this work is not polemical against Islam or Muhammad. It's to argue that Jews should convert to Christianity. This is just an aside, something that happens during the broader story. So there's no reason to believe that it was written to be polemical against Muslims. It claims that Abraham got this knowledge from those who met him, i.e. that it's based on eyewitness testimony, and various details in the story, such as the Candidatus Sergius, are confirmed by external sources, independently confirmed by other sources. And even this seemingly outrageous phrase that he has the keys of paradise is found in other texts. And it's not something that Muslims today would go around saying, but it is found in early Islamic texts that Muhammad claimed to have the keys of paradise. Our next set of texts are texts that derive from the Apocalypse of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. This work proved to be very popular and had a number of derivative works based on it. The original was lost, but it is likely composed between 635 and 645. Of these texts, the most important is the Secrets of Rabbi Shimon, which was written in the mid-8th century. It purports to predict the events from the time of the conquest to the Abbasid Revolution. So it's probably likely written around 750, but it pretends that it was written around the year like maybe 620 or something. And it's all set as a prediction of the future of these events that have in reality actually taken place. It's a reflection on Numbers 24:21. Supposedly, it is revelation that comes from an angel, which interprets that verse as a prophecy of the Ishmaelites conquering Israel. This is then tied to Isaiah 21:6 and 7, which is a well-known messianic text. And it concludes with a prediction of a 2,000-year messianic reign beginning with the Abbasid Revolution, i.e., beginning in its own time. So it takes these past events and casts them as prophecy to give legitimacy to its actual prediction, which is that the messianic reign is beginning. Just read one key line here. Do not be afraid, mortal, for the Holy One, blessed is he, is bringing about the kingdom of Ishmael only for the purpose of delivering you from that wicked one, that is Edom, which was a common term used to describe Rome. This is written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew is somewhat ambiguous, but there is a textual variant which seems to clarify the meaning. In the textual variant, it says, he raises over them a crazy prophet possessed by a spirit. Despite this description of Muhammad as a crazy prophet possessed by a spirit, it paints a positive view of the conquest. It sees the conquest as fulfilling God's purposes. It doesn't say that Muhammad is a true prophet, but he says that he is a person being used by God to bring about, to usher in the Messianic era and rid the country or the region of Roman rule. So we can see that these Messianic expectations are similar to what we found in the Doctrina. However, in the Secrets, the chronology has been misplaced. It's put at the end of the work instead of where it would be in the historical events, which is an indication that this was borrowed from the earlier text, meaning this description probably goes back to that 635 to 645 time period. The 10 Kings Midrash is also derived from the same apocalypse. A couple key lines from this text. Great men of Israel will join with him and give him a wife from among them. He will conquer all the kingdom and come to Jerusalem. He will seize the kingship by force, and then he will die. So here we have a clear statement that Muhammad died after the conquest of Jerusalem. Probably based on the wording, probably shortly after the conquest. So maybe he died around 634, 635, somewhere around there, according to this text. Possibly in Jerusalem, although the place is not explicitly mentioned. The Kazakhstan Chronicle is up next. This is an anonymous work dated around 660, based on its internal consequence, i.e. it doesn't describe anything that took place after 652, so it's presumably written shortly after that, 660 being a round number to give a guess. It describes Muhammad as an agent of God sent against the Persians and then the Byzantines. So like the Jewish text, it views Muhammad as someone being used by God, not a true prophet, but someone being used for God's purpose, in this case to bring judgment against the Persians.
A bit like how in Isaiah, God uses Cyrus to destroy the Babylonians.
Exactly.
Doesn't mean that God thought Cyrus was great. It's just that God used Cyrus to destroy the Babylonians.
Yeah, exactly. That's how these sources are viewing the conquest of the Muslim armies and the conquest of Muhammad and his people. They're viewing it as something that God is allowing for a purpose, but they're not saying that he's sent by God directly. The source of the Kazakhstan Chronicle is unclear, but due to the proximity and time to the events it describes, it could very easily be based on eyewitness testimony. A couple key lines: then God raised up against them the sons of Ishmael like sand on the seashore. Their leader was Muhammad. And then the conquest is described and says, they also went to the land of the Byzantines, plundering and laying waste to the entire region of Syria. So Muhammad is explicitly named as the leader of the army during the conquest. He's said to be an instrument of God, that he is being used, no doubt, in his own selfish he's acting on his own selfish desires, but he's being used to exercise judgment against the Persians. And the text says that he conquers Syria. The chronological charts of Jacob was composed in 691 or 692. It does incorrectly list Muhammad's death as in 627 or 628. So you ask, well, why am I appealing to this source? Well, it also lists the conquest of Palestine 2 years prior to his death. And the source is generally highly reliable. So it probably just displaced both of these events by, like 6-7 years. But that the chronology is the same, that the conquest happened before the death of Muhammad. Next, we have the histories of the patriarchs of Alexandria. This is a long, complex text. It gives the complete history of the Coptic Church. So consistent with giving the complete history of the Coptic Church, it's been revised many times throughout its history. The section that we look at that describes the conquest of Syria was written no later than 717. In this passage, Heracles, the Byzantine emperor, he has a dream that warns him that a circumcised nation is about to come against him. He mistakenly thinks it is either going to be the Jews or the Samaritans, so in his infinite wisdom, he has these groups forcefully baptized so that they won't be a threat against his rule. But then this narration that we're about to read explains how he was in error, how he misinterpreted his dream. After a few days, there arose a man among the Arabs from the southern regions, from Mecca and its vicinity, named Muhammad. And he took possession of Damascus in Syria, and he crossed the Jordan and dammed it up, and the Lord abandoned the army of the Romans before him. So like all of this text we've seen so far, this isn't polemical. It's painting a positive picture, a basically positive picture of Muhammad, and it's saying things that are consistent with Islamic belief, other than that Muhammad was still alive at this time. And we see
it should just be stated the reason why the Copts initially may have interpreted the conquest of the Arabs against the Byzantine Empire was because the Orthodox Church of Europe had falsely understood and accused the Orthodox Church in Egypt of a heresy, which it's very disputable that they believe in that heresy or ever did, and was persecuting them and discriminating against them for that. And there was a very short period in which their sort of being free of Byzantine came as a sense of relief. But that was a very short-lived honeymoon before they realized that they just replaced a discriminator with a persecutor.
Yeah, and that's consistent with this being written at a very early date, because they haven't yet realized the consequences of this, and they think that it's an act of God. And to your point, you can see that in the text I didn't read. It's referencing the Council of Chalcedon, where the Coptic Church was condemned. Next up, we have a pair of works that are collectively called the Spanish Chronicles, the Byzantine Arab Chronicle of 741 and the Hispanic Chronicle of 754. They have a shared common source. Now, you might ask, why am I going all the way to Spain to get information about what was happening in the Middle East? And that's because the shared source that they have is likely derived from the region of Syria or thereabouts. These sources were made under Islamic rule of Spain. They were written by Christians, but they had limited freedom to say what they wanted to say. So thus, they both paint a positive picture of early Islam. They are restricted in what they're allowed to say. So what they're saying is compatible with Islamic belief at the time. They don't get into the religious history. They don't make any attempt to make religious judgments about Muhammad. They just cover the political history, the military history. We'll take a look at the Byzantine Arab Chronicle here, a couple key words. When a most numerous multitude of Saracens had gathered together, they invaded the provinces of Syria, Arabia, and Mesopotamia, while one named Muhammad held the position of leadership over them. And then describes the conquest and makes the following statement. When Muhammad, the previously mentioned leader of the Saracens, had finished 10 years of rule, he reached the end of his life. Once again, Palestine is clearly conquered before the death of Muhammad. Once again, he's clearly said to be in charge of the army during that conquest. This source takes a slightly different angle in that it divides the campaign into two stages, whereas the other sources had described it as a one-stage conquest. This might be an attempt to harmonize the older history that we've seen in the previous sources with the emerging Islamic histories, such as that which was written by, or perhaps being written by, Ibn Ishaq around this time frame, which could possibly be seen as state propaganda to rewrite the biography of Muhammad. There are a few additional sources which we won't look at, but I just want to make it clear that there's tons and tons of sources of information that all put the death of Muhammad after the conquest. There's a Syriac common source, a Syriac chronicle of 775, a report in Abul Faith's Samaritan Chronicle, and then we have a letter that purports to be from Umar written to King Leo. This text reads, this text says that Muhammad led his followers out of Arabia, quote, to fight against the largest empires, the most evidently powerful nations, whose rule over other peoples was the most ruthless, that is to say, Persia and Byzantium. And it explicitly ties this to receiving the revelation of Surah 9:29.
Can I just dive in a minute there, and just I want to underscore an observation that comes across from this, is that, you know, when I argue for the resurrection, I always make the sort of case of you've got independent authors writing independently from one another who are talking about and sort of cross-referencing the same event. So independent and early sources. And what we've got here are independent early sources that are cross-referencing on a singular point that Muhammad was the conqueror of Syria. And they're obviously not talking about Muhammad as a totem or this sort of figure that's already dead, but a figure that's actually a participant. And obviously, you know, the Islamic conquest, or if we could call it that, the Islamic conquest of the Near East, as well as just horrifically violent and destructive to the whole of the region, and sort of killing any idea that Islam is a religion born in peace or comes in peace. But it's also the fact that would have had a massive impact. So obviously people would have written about it. So this is exactly what we would expect to see. We would expect to see lots of people talking about this traumatic event that happened in their history, in their time. And these sources are predating the Islamic sources, which I find really interesting. Correct. So I'm going to be really interested to see how you square this circle of the earlier sources, all independently written in different places by different people, all saying the same thing about Muhammad conquering Syria, and that being contradicted by later Islamic sources. I'm really interested to see how you square that circle for me.
Yes, absolutely. That we'll get to my conclusions at the end, but a couple conclusions first about these sources. As you noted, these are coming from a wide variety of different people. We saw Christian sources, we saw Jewish sources, we saw a Samaritan source, and we even saw a letter purporting to be from Umar, so nominally a Islamic sources. We've looked at about a dozen sources here, and these are largely all independent of one another. They independently tell the same history. There are no extant sources that say something different from this time period. All of the extant sources say the same thing, that Muhammad was in charge when the conquering of the Syrian region occurred. And there's no clear motive to make this up. Why would all these sources invent this? It doesn't seem to serve any purpose.
And that's super crucial. Sorry, I know I'm just acting like the underliner and the highlighter here, but that is a super crucial point. There's no common reason for us to understand why all these sources and all these independent writers writing in different places at different times, but all earlier than the Islamic sources, would all coalesce around the idea that Muhammad conquered Syria. Because in those times, that would have been a way of, that would have almost been to his acclaim. That's not a polemic. It's not like they celebrated the emperors of Rome for, even if Byzantium, for conquering land, and the Persian kings celebrated for conquests. So it's not a polemic to say Muhammad conquered Syria. It's almost incidental, accidental acclaim.
Exactly. So, there's no motive to make this up, as you underscored there. Now, it's possible one or two sources could have made a mistake, but all these sources independently making the same mistake and no one getting the correct history doesn't seem very probable to me. And we even find some echoes of this in Islamic sources. A good indication that something is correct is when you kind of see a subtle hint of it in the sources that have been cleansed. They removed the embarrassing parts, but they left behind some incidental details that give a hint that there might have been a different narrative originally. Ibn Sa'd's hadith collection contains a hadith that states that, speaking of Muhammad, states his birthplace is Makkah and his place of migration is Medina, and his rule is over Syria, an implicit statement that Muhammad conquered Syria and ruled over it. Furthermore, in the Sahih traditions, there are multiple hadith that state that Muhammad died at age 63, but there's also numerous Sahih hadith that state that he died at age 65. 2 years later, about which these non-Islamic history sources are suggesting he probably died about 2 to 3 years later than Muslims claim. So if the Muslim sources have changed the death date of Muhammad, we have to ask the question, why would they do this? Why would they change the death of Muhammad? One suggestion is that they wanted to make him into a martyr. This doesn't really strike me as a very good explanation, because they could have made the poisoning story that supposedly makes him into a martyr occur at any time and place. So it doesn't seem to be a reason to change the date. A more compelling theory is the rise of the Abbasids created this new narrative to undermine the earlier Umayyad authority, which was centered in Syria, by saying that Muhammad was never in Syria, that Muhammad didn't start a reign in Syria. They undermined the authority of the Umayyads, who, at this time period, around the time period when Btbsoco is being written, there's a dispute over who is going to be controlling the Islamic State going forward. Another possibility, however, is that it was changed to cover up embarrassing information. specifically in direct response to Christian polemics against Islam, arguments that Christians were making at that time period as to why Muhammad must be a false prophet.
Do you have an idea of what those arguments would be?
Yes, we're going to see those arguments.
Oh, sorry. Right, I do apologize.
So we'll now turn from looking at, more or less unbiased historical sources to looking at Christian polemics against Islam. We'll look at the death of Muhammad in Christian polemics. Now, these texts are basically completely discarded a priori by historians. They're discarded without even looking at them. That may seem reasonable. I mean, why would you look for a polemical source for historical information? But actually, this is unusual. This is not usually the way history is done, because this idea of a disinterested, just the facts history is a modern invention. This is not the way that ancient people wrote history. So historians will look at highly biased sources, and they'll use them as secondary evidence. They'll say, yes, we can't take this at face value, but what can we learn from it? And when we apply that method to these texts, we're going to see that careful analysis of these polemical texts usually shows that they're not made up. They're based on reinterpretation of Muslim tradition. They take things that are found in the Muslim tradition and they interpret them in light of the Christian understanding of who God is. Not all that different to what we do today. We take things that Muslims claim are true, and we show how even if we grant their truth, it makes Islam false, it makes Islam repugnant. And that's not all that different than what Christians were doing back in the 7th, 8th, 9th century.
And nor is it very different from what Muslims try to do with our Bible.
Exactly.
Or with church history.
So what we're going to see is, since we already have reason to believe that reinterpretation of the death of Muhammad has taken place, we should take these stories seriously. We shouldn't just accept them at face value, but we should look at them and see what they can tell us about Islamic history. And what we're going to see is that in many cases, they're borrowed from hadith that are now judged unreliable, those strange and weird things that Islam QA referred to. It wasn't Christians who created these stories. They took Islamic stories and then they used them as polemics, and then the stories were abandoned in response to those polemics. And
sorry, I know I'm interrupting again, but in the same way that we find at the corner when we quote a Sahih hadith to the Dawa gangs, their first instinct is immediately to say it's false until they prove it, unquestionably prove it.
Yeah, similar idea to that they changed their tradition. They discarded elements of their tradition that were being used as polemics against them. And finally, we'll see that even the reliable hadith sometimes contain echoes of these stories. So I'm going to run through the sources. I'll try to get through them pretty quickly. And then after laying out all the sources, we're going to analyze them in light of what the Islamic texts say. I've highlighted some things in red that we'll see correspondence to in the Islamic texts. We begin with the legend of Sergius Bahera. This was probably composed by a monk in what is modern-day Iraq around the year 810. It survives in 4 versions in multiple different languages, so we have a pretty good idea of what the text originally said. And indeed, the legend is similar to the version of the same tale told by Btbsoco. In short, the work as a whole describes a Christian monk who teaches Muhammad about Christianity and then eventually validates his prophethood as being a true prophet coming in the line of the previous biblical prophets. In the Syriac versions of the legend, there is an account of Muhammad's death that appears to have been added after the fact. This likely indicates that it originally circulated as a separate unit in the 9th century, so dates from the same time period but written by a different author originally. Looking a little bit at that, the description of Muhammad's death, we read, when Muhammad dies, he will ascend to heaven like Isa, son of Miriam, and will be resurrected after 3 days. And this is, according to the legend, this is something that Cobb said. The legend then describes that Muhammad was laid in a house with great reverence. They sealed the door to see what would become of him, to see if he would resurrect like he promised he would. But after 3 days, they went and investigated, and no one could enter the house because of the stench of Muhammad's body. And it ends with this great comment: no one needs to investigate what happened to it. Come to the Apology of Al-Kindi. The dating of this work is somewhat controversial. It internally claims to be written in the 820s, but some scholars have dated it to a late period. It's a very important work, so there's a lot of scholarship looking at it. However, Christina Zalagi has demonstrated that it has intricate knowledge of the time period, i.e. of the early 800s, and she has further shown that it's consistent with hadith written in that same time period. So there's no good reason to date it later than its internal claim. As I already said, this is a very popular and influential text in medieval Christianity. The work as a whole is a complete, extensive biography of Muhammad. And although it's clearly polemical, it's clearly arguing that he's a false prophet and so on, all of the events of the biography are able to be tied with events in the standard Islamic history. They're things that Muslims would agree with, they just would disagree on the details. That is, the events have not been altered, they've not been created wholesale. Rather, Al-Kindi has changed the emphasis of things and added his own commentary. Couple key lines here. He says that Muhammad said he would be raised to heaven as Christ, the Lord of the world, was raised, and that he was so precious to God that he would not leave him on earth for more than 3 days. He died on a Monday, the 12th of Rabi al-Awwali, aged 63. After having been ill for 14 days, they left him unburied. So, Bob, do you happen to know the traditional date of Muhammad's death offhand? I'm guessing probably not, but
the date. Oh, I know by the Christian calendar, the year 632.
yeah. So this there's some dispute over the exact day, but this 12th of the month of Rabi al-Awwal is one of the dates found in Islamic texts. So this is consistent with Islamic claims about when Muhammad died. Al-Kindi continues, when 3 days had passed, his smell had changed, their hope of ascension had died away, and they despaired of his vain promises, and they had uncovered his lie. They interred him on a Wednesday. He then gives some details of the burial, including this line about his belly swelling up and his left finger, that is his little finger, turning backwards. And then he doesn't know what kind of clothing that Muhammad was buried in. He gives two conflicting sources, one saying he was buried in a red cloth, one saying he was buried in white Yemeni clothes. And he gives names of sources for both of these. We'll come back to that in a minute, but just keep in mind that when he's unsure of something, he's attributing it to a specific person as opposed to, just making a guess. The Cashin document is written in the late 8th or early 9th century. It claims to be based on information obtained from a Muslim convert to Christianity, that someone who had left Islam gave these details about Islamic history. It contains an account of Muhammad's life and describes some Islamic rituals. The writing is consistent with oral testimony. We obviously can't say one way or another whether the person supplying this information was actually a convert, but it's consistent with it being oral testimony. And then you can see where the extant copies come from. It was possibly originally written in Syrian or Arabic. It contains the following line: "They did not bury him, saying that on the 3rd day he would rise like Christ. And when the drowsy disciples were asleep, dogs entered and ate the face of the corpse. Consequently, it was prescribed by his disciples to kill dogs in that month observing this custom up to the present day. They kill dogs in that month. The Historia de Mahomet was composed no later than 850 because it contains an internal note about it being rediscovered by a certain individual. It proved to be popular and was reused by several later writings, and as the name implies, it is a history of Muhammad up to and including his death. On the death of Muhammad, it says that he predicted that he would be revived on the third day by the angel Gabriel. They ordered his body to be guarded with an arduous vigil, anxious about the miracle which he had promised them. When on the third day they saw that he was rotting, they determined that it was because the angels were afraid of their presence, so they left the body unguarded, and instead of angels coming, dogs followed the stench and devoured his flank. Because of this, they surrendered the rest of the body to the soil, and they ordered that dogs be slaughtered every year in vengeance for desecrating his body. We also have the Adnotatio Mahometus, which is an appendix to a letter of John of Seville. It appears to have circulated as its own unit prior to when John's letter was written, which was 851, so it predates that time. He gives an abbreviated history of Muhammad, including on his death. When death was approaching, he promised to rise up on the third day, but by the negligence of the guards, he was discovered to have been devoured by dogs, and it likely shares a common source with the Historia. We also have the Book of Rolls, which is a Christian apocalypse written in the early Abbasid period, that is the 9th century. It was written in Arabic, uncertain origins, but likely comes from Western Syria. This work purports to be a prophecy of Jesus given to Peter about the totality of the Islamic rule. And on the death of Muhammad, it declares, Jesus speaking declares, "Know, Peter, that when the leader of perdition, that is Muhammad, dies, I will send the foul animal to exhume him from his grave and eat his flesh." So, of course, this isn't actually a prophecy by Jesus that was given to Peter and didn't show up until the 9th century. What it actually is someone trying to give authority to their own writing by describing known past events as being a prophecy of Jesus. But if this is a known past event, that suggests that there is at least good reason for the author to believe this actually happened. Just a couple more here. We've looked at Christian sources. Now let's look at a Jewish source. The commentary on Isaiah by Yafat bin Eli, who is a 10th century Jewish scholar. He contains this description, which is an integral part of his commentary, i.e. he hasn't taken an existing tale of the death of Muhammad and just added it into the text. Rather, he's integrated information that he considers well known as he is trying to interpret the Bible. On Isaiah 14:19, which a reference reads, "But you are cast out of your grave like a rejected branch," he writes that this describes the man of the Spirit, and claimed that they removed him from his grave, and the lions ate him. Nothing remained from him save his heel. Now, the man of spirit is a very common Jewish polemical term used as a description of Muhammad based on Hosea 9:7. So this certainly is referring to Muhammad, but it is written as commentary on Isaiah. Finally, we even have Muslim testimony to this story about Muhammad his body being dug up and devoured by dogs in Islamic sources. Because later Muslim legal texts include this curious ruling attributed to Malik ibn Anas and transmitted on the authority of Ibn al-Qasim, which the text reads that a Christian Egyptian was saying the following: "Poor Muhammad, he is telling you that he is in paradise, but his wealth did not benefit his soul when dogs were eating his legs." And then the Malik asks what they should, or someone asks Malik what they should do about this, and Malik answers, "I think he should be executed." So this makes it into the Islamic sources as a legal ruling against people who were repeating this story about Muhammad being eaten by dogs, which proves that the story had to exist in order for a legal ruling about what to do with people saying this. So here's a summary chart from Christina Zalagi. She divided the sources into 3 categories. So there are at least 3 independent lines of evidence and perhaps more of these Christian polemics that they independently derived the same information in at least 3 different lines.
Which would suggest that perhaps they actually got that information from the Muslims, the very, very first, in quote marks, Muslims themselves.
Exactly. So this is Christina's own summary. She says, "We can thus conclude that the Christian story of Muhammad's death was, in all probability, known among Christians in the Near East during the first half of the 8th century. Some common elements among these tales. And then we'll look at possible Islamic origins for these polemics. Common themes include the prophecy of resurrection or ascension, usually given by Muhammad himself, but in one case coming from Ka'b. There's an expectation that Gabriel will be the one who raises Muhammad in one version. In several versions, a corpse is locked away in a house or it's placed in a garden in one version. In multiple versions, guards are said to be watching over the body. In nearly all versions, the body is said to begin to stink after 3 days, and then in some of the versions, dogs eat part or most of the body, and a yearly massacre of dogs is ordered in revenge for this tale, for desecrating the body. Zalagi remarks, "Yet however preposterous the Christian legend of Muhammad's death may appear, the Christians did not invent it. They borrowed almost all the motifs from the early Muslim tradition. And as we'll see, thanks to her work, the individual elements of the story have been found in Islamic texts. Not the Sahih collections, obviously, but in other Muslim texts which have been rejected but have still survived to the present day. In one case, even being word for word copied from an Islamic text." I'll take the elements I'll take them one element at a time, looking at the sources for each of the major motifs of the death of Muhammad in the polemical sources. So first of all, we have this seemingly outrageous claim that Muhammad said that he would resurrect from the dead or that he would ascend straight into heaven without dying, that kind of thing. There are numerous hadith that refer to the ascension of prophets in general. And sometimes these are made in reference to Muhammad's fate. We have, for example, this very interesting hadith, which declares that Al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik was at a particular time, or that a tomb collapsed during his reign as caliphate and during the reign of the governorship of Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz over Medina. And here's what happens. So the tomb collapses and a foot appeared to them. They dreaded that it might be the foot of the messenger of God. So they're all, very concerned about this. And then Said comes along and he says, "The corpses of the prophet, may God bless them, do not remain in the earth for more than 40 days. Then they ascend." So saying, this can't possibly be Muhammad's foot because he must have ascended after 40 days.
Who else could it be?
Yeah, exactly. So someone comes along, Salim comes along, and he says, "Oh, I recognize that. That's the foot of my grandfather Umar." Well, this is, just on the surface, this is utterly ridiculous. Who is going to recognize the rotted foot of their grandfather?
In the tomb of Muhammad.
Yes, in the tomb
I
of
mean, the clue's
Muhammad.
in the title. It's called the Tomb of Muhammad.
So, what? But why would they be dreading that a foot had appeared? They knocked over the tomb. His part of his body came out of the soil. On the surface, that doesn't sound like a big deal. But the reason they're fearing this is exactly because of what Said says here, that the corpses of the prophet are supposed to ascend after 40 days. So if they actually found Muhammad's body, at least according to this early Islamic belief, that would prove that he was a false prophet because he didn't ascend like they believed that he should have. So that's why they're concerned. And then they solve the problem by someone recognizing the foot. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Then we have another hadith here. This one comes from Jami's Safian al-Thari. He writes, or the hadith declares that prophets possessing fortitude do not stay in the earth beyond 40 days before they ascend to heaven. The prophet of God did not stay in the earth longer than 40 days before he ascended. We also have additional hadith here attributed to Jafar al-Sadiq. No prophet or legatee remains in the earth for more than 3 days before he ascends. So we see some disagreement about whether it's 40 days or 3 days, but either way, an expectation of some sort of thing happening. That the body will be taken up into heaven, or that the person will come back to life, as we're about to see in the Sahih tradition. And similar things are found in other hadith as well. But we even see an indication of this idea, vaguely in the Sahih tradition that wasn't whitewashed out. In Sahih Bukhari, after Muhammad died, Abu Bakr was away from the scene initially, and Umar stands up and says, "By Allah, Allah's messenger is not dead." Umar also says, "By Allah, nothing occurred to my mind except that. Verily, Allah will resurrect him, and he will cut the hands and the legs of some men." So this is kind of vague, but we see some sort of expectation, at least coming from Umar, that Muhammad wasn't really dead. He just appeared to be dead, and he was about to be resurrected. Perhaps inspired by the sayings of Muhammad himself, as the Christian polemics assert, or perhaps just derived from an expectation that he would be like Jesus and resurrect after some days. A later version of this hadith, coming from a so-called unreliable source, says, "He has not died, but rather he has gone to the Lord, just as Musa ibn Umran remained absent from his people for 40 days, after which he returned to them." So it could also be derived, strangely enough, based on when Moses went up on the mountain and people started to think that something had happened to him, and then of course he eventually returned. And we're also going to, in a minute, see that Ibn Hassam has echoes of this as well. But let's go back real quick to the apology of Al-Kindi. As a reminder, he wrote, "Furthermore, yet monstrous than this and more repugnant is that he used to say in his life that he enjoined them that when he died, he should not bury him because he would be raised to heaven as Christ the Lord of the world was raised, and that he was so precious to God that he would not leave him in the earth for more than 3 days." Al-Kindi is written in Arabic, and I have the transliterated Arabic on the screen there. And, you don't have to know Arabic to see that the transliterated Arabic of a hadith that is found in 3 different hadith collections is basically exactly the same. And Al-Kindi got this from an Islamic source. Unless we want to assert that the Muslims were using Al-Kindi as a source, which doesn't seem very probable, he must have gotten it from a Muslim source, because you don't have exact word-for-word correspondence accidentally. The Muslim source reads, "I am so precious to God that he will not leave me in the earth after 3. It doesn't use the word days, but it's implied. And in one of the 3 sources it occurs, Ghazali attempts to reinterpret it to mean after 3 decades, and which is an indication that this is an early tradition. He couldn't just discard it. He couldn't just say that this is a not reliable tradition. He has to try to reinterpret it to say it just says after 3, which the implication is 3 days, but he says it doesn't say 3 days. Maybe he meant 3 decades. That is when he would arise, and then of course no one would know whether his body went up into heaven after 3 decades or not. They would know it didn't after 3 days, but they wouldn't necessarily know where it was 60 years later. And I wanted to point out as well that in addition to this word-for-word correspondence, we see Al-Kindi quoting sources, saying specific people made this claim. And as I pointed out earlier, when he doesn't know which claim is correct, he gives both versions, attributing it to 2 different people. They can't possibly both be correct, but he doesn't know which one's correct, so he gives them both. Clear indication that he had access to Muslim sources. He had access to Muslim proto-Hadith collections.
Sorry, just remind me again when Al-Kindi was written, if you know off the top of your head.
I believe 820.
820. Well, we can always go back and check. It was just to help me with my own thoughts. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and go double check that.
No, please.
I've already done it.
There we are.
Yep, 820. Approximately 820. Okay. All right. So we see that the delayed burial. So the second motif is the delayed burial of Muhammad. This is different than the claim that he would resurrect. All branches of Islam agree that Muhammad died on a Monday. So the accepted Sunni tradition is actually split here. Some say that he was buried overnight between Monday and Tuesday, or overnight between Tuesday and Wednesday. The standard narrative that we looked at earlier said Wednesday. Shia traditions are unanimous that was a Wednesday burial. Ibn Hassam puts the burial in the middle of the night on Wednesday, whereas other early so-called unauthentic hadith record the possibility of burial overnight Wednesday to Thursday as well, or maybe even that it occurred during the day. So there's a lot of confusion about when Muhammad died, or when Muhammad was buried. This is probably an indication, like when you see all kinds of different sources saying all kinds of different things, that's probably an indication that no one really remembers, that they have lost the actual tradition, the actual history behind it. We see in surviving Kufan, that is Iraqi hadith, that the burial was definitely delayed. There's descriptions of the body changing colors, including having green fingernails. It said that he was buried only after death had become apparent, which would not be consistent with an early burial, obviously. They say that his corpse was bloated and bent. And then I'll quote this one particular hadith, which is going to come into play later. When the Prophet died, Abu Bakr was absent, and he came after 3. No one dared to uncover his face until the abdomen became ashen-colored. Abu Bakr uncovered his face. A Bazan hadith likewise speaks of a bloated corpse, and several of these traditions, including the one I just quoted about Abu Bakr, are quoted by Al-Tabri, the earliest person, or at least the most important comprehensive history of Islam. His history spans 40 volumes of text, I believe. He quotes these traditions. These traditions were acceptable enough in his time for him to at least include them, even if he ultimately dismissed them as not being correct. And note that none of these hadith are attributed to an eyewitness. That is, they don't have an isnad that goes all the way back to an eyewitness. Now, Muslims are going to jump on that and say, see, we know that these are unreliable. They don't go back to an eyewitness. They don't go back to a companion. But from a historical perspective, this actually means they're more reliable because it means they're earlier. It means that they were composed before the hadith science tradition had evolved, before the ruling that an isnad had to go back to a companion, and thus anything they wanted to retain, they just created an isnad going back to a companion. No historian thinks that those chains have any real meaning, but the lack of a complete chain, they have a partial chain, like the tradition was developing, but the lack of a complete chain suggests these are actually very early hadith. Finally, continuing on the delayed burial of Umar, we already saw the story in Sahih Bukhari, but now let's look at it in Ibn Hassam as well. That they contain this story that Umar believed that Muhammad would return after 40 days. After some time period goes by, Abu Bakr arrives on the scene, and it's he who declares that Muhammad is truly dead, that he then convinces people in a speech that it was okay. And Ibn Hassam and other sources use this line that he quoted the Quran as if the verse had never been heard before, perhaps because it never had been heard before. The verse about how all prophets die. Ibn Hassam writes, Muhammad has gone, or Abu Bakr, Umar, as quoted by Ibn Hassam, says, Muhammad has gone to his Lord as Musa ibn Imran went and was hidden from his people for 40 days, returning to them after it was said that he had died. By God, the apostle will return as Moses returns. Now, there are many versions of this and other sources deemed unreliable by Muslims today. Usually Umar acts alone, but in Ibn Sa'd's version, many Muslims share his opinion. And in this version, it's actually Abbas who opposes Umar, not Abu Bakr. We'll read a portion of that speech by Abbas here. He declares, his odor changes. People bury your master. He is so precious to God that he will not let him die twice. Would he let you die once and him twice? He's too precious to God for that. People bury your master. If it is indeed as you say, nothing can prevent God from digging him up on the earth. He then declares how Muhammad fulfilled his mission and says once again, people bury your master. And compare this to what Abu Bakr says in the Ibn Hassam recension, that a second death will never overtake you, that they both are supplying as justification for Muhammad really being dead, that he's too good to die twice. Then we have even more evidence of disagreement here. All kinds of confusion about what exactly happened when Muhammad died. Again, an indication that people are perhaps have forgotten the original and they are telling different conflicting tales. There's a Medinan tradition that depicts the community divided over the question of whether Muhammad died or not. Bazran Hadith states that the companions assembled and decided to wait on burial, saying, perhaps he has ascended. Hadith attributed to al-Waqidi says, Umar believed Muhammad was taken directly into heaven without dying. That is just like Jesus in the Islamic tradition, that his entire body had ascended up into heaven. There is another hadith that contains a similar claim, but ascribes it to the people instead of Uthman, and the people then demanded that Muhammad not be buried and started threatening those who said otherwise. So the consistent element is that there's a disagreement about whether Muhammad is dead or not. What's inconsistent is exactly who was disputing with who. And we see evidence of this dispute even in the Sahih tradition. A line from Ibn Hassam, which he says that Ibn Ishaq got directly from Fatima, says that Aisha said, we know nothing about the burial of the apostle until we heard the sound of pickaxes in the middle of Wednesday night. And if you recall, at the beginning, the standard narrative I read included this detail that he was surprisingly buried in the middle of the night. Abbas stood up and said, indeed, the messenger of Allah died, and he is nothing but a human being, and decomposes like any human, O people, bury your companion. And this is a different tradition than the one about Abbas that I read earlier. So this particular tradition here, unlike the earlier one, although it has some similarities, is judged to be sahih. It is judged to be an authentic tradition. So then the next motif that we have is this locked room, or the body being placed in a garden and people waiting for something to happen, being guarded by guards and then waiting for something to happen. Ibn Hassam records an odd scene where the community gathers to decide who will succeed Muhammad. He writes, "Now the apostle was still in the house, the burial arrangements had not been completed, and his family had locked the door of the house." So in addition to the strange fact that people want to argue over who gets to succeed Muhammad first, not bury him and then figure that kind of thing out after a period of mourning, there's also this...
Not even in the grave, and they're already going after his goods.
Exactly, yeah. And I'll touch on that in my conclusion as to what that means about the early followers of Muhammad and how they viewed him, or at least how some of them viewed him. But then, even in addition to that odd dispute, there's the fact that the family locked the door. Why in the world did they lock the house so that no one could see the body of Muhammad? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It might be an echo of this tale that's only found in the Christian, explicitly found in the Christian polemics, about them thinking he was going to resurrect, so they locked the door to prove that he had actually resurrected and someone hadn't tampered with the body. And then there's a rare tradition that says that Muslims prayed over Muhammad's body in a garden. Again, not necessarily indicating that it's historical, but indicating that the Christian sources are borrowing information from Islamic sources, that they're not just making things up, that they're retelling the tale of the death of Muhammad in their own understanding, but they're not inventing a story wholesale. Finally, we have to ask the question, what about the dogs?
Those poor dogs.
Well, unlike the other motif, this one there is no direct mention in Islamic texts, which casts some doubt on it, and it doesn't definitively rule it out, but it does make it less certain than the other details. And it's long been assumed that this was a pure polemical invention, that this is something that Christians just totally made up wholesale. However, the earlier studies, the earlier academic studies on the Muslim tradition, they didn't have access to the Eastern texts that we looked at. They only had access to the Western European texts that were written in a completely different milieu, and these stories usually transformed the animal eating the body into a pig, where it serves as a clear polemical purpose. Muhammad said that pigs were unclean, and then a pig comes and eats his body. But in the East, where the story originated, it's not actually all that clear if the dogs really add anything to the polemic. There is the fact that the Bible associates, or has a couple tales of the bodies of wicked people being eaten by lions or eaten by dogs, and bodies of saints being preserved and not eaten by animals. But the lions is the one that's much more strongly associated with judgment, associated with God's judgment. So if they're inventing the story wholesale, it would seem that that would be a more likely invention. And indeed, in the Jewish version of the tale, that is exactly what he did. He said that it was eaten by lions because he was commenting, it was, as a commentary on the biblical text, he was tying it directly to the biblical text. He made the body devoured by lions instead of dogs. Furthermore, it's now known that the educated people, i.e. those who would have the ability to read and write, the people writing down these stories, they didn't actually believe that preservation of the body was essential for end times resurrection. This was a Christian belief at one time, but it was no longer the belief of educated people of the day. They did not think that they were essential. So Muhammad's body being devoured by dogs would be relatively unimportant detail in comparison to his failed prediction to resurrect, for example. And then finally, there's the fact that it's not at all improbable. There is nothing improbable about wild animals digging up and eating a human corpse. This was common occurrence in the ancient world.
Especially if it had been allowed to rot a bit
Exactly.
outside, you know. So, but also, yeah, I mean, if a sheep can get inside a house to eat a page of the Quran, then why can't a dog get in to nibble on a rotting corpse?
Exactly. And we do have a bit of a Sahih echo in Islam's strange treatment of dogs. In Sahih Muslim, for example, Allah's messenger ordered the killing of dogs, and we would send men in Medina and its corners, and we did not spare any dog that we did not kill, so much so that we killed the dog that accompanied the wet she-camel belonging to the people of the desert. So
And
there's
that would
zeal
line
for
up with the
killing dogs.
Christian. That would line up with the Christian sources that talk about Muslims killing dogs in the cities at a certain month in the year.
Yes, exactly. So, we see this, we don't see it tied directly to the death of Muhammad in the Islamic sources, but we do see the command to kill dogs. And, the fact that two sources independently said that this was a yearly tradition, even though it's no longer a yearly tradition, probably indicates it was at some point a tradition to go and kill the dogs once a year, the stray animals. And to be clear, a wild dog was a pest in the ancient world. It was a creature that wreaked havoc on human civilization. So it makes sense in that regard, but that only explains the killing of wild dogs. It doesn't understand why their zeal was so great that they even went and killed these useful servant animals. This dog that was accompanying a camel, being a guardian against it. We also see in Sahih Bukhari, attributed directly to the words of Muhammad, whoever keeps a dog which is neither a watchdog nor a hunting dog, he will get a daily deduction of 2 karat from his good deeds. And for those who are not familiar with the Muslim conception of earning points for doing good and evil, this is a big deal to say that you're going to lose 2 points a day just for having a dog. And finally, a third example, and there are many more, there's dozens of hadith, but a third diverse example, the prayer is severed by a black dog and a woman who has reached the age of menstruation. But this isn't the complete story, because if we look at the Sahih tradition, we also see a very different picture painted of dogs in Sahih Bukhari 174. Someone declares that during the lifetime of Allah's apostle, the dogs used to urinate and pass through the mosques, i.e. come and go freely. Nevertheless, they never used to sprinkle water on it, the urine of dogs. So in this, they're so unconcerned about dogs that they don't even mind the dog wandering through the holy mosque and going to the bathroom inside the mosque. Contrast this to the this great zeal for killing all dogs, even useful dogs. And it seems very likely that at some point in Islamic history, something changed, that the attitude towards dogs had a great change take place. One possible explanation for that is indeed that it was done in revenge for the dogs desecrating Muhammad's body.
Or they kept pissing in the mosque.
That could be too.
Because, God, all the animals are in perfect submission to Allah, of course.
Of course. So I wanted to end with this final interesting illustration from Islamic texts that kind of gives us a hint about how things were developing, how the story of Muhammad was changing. This is based on a tale about Waqi bin al-Jarrah, which is found in several sources. He said that in the year 800 or 801, he got into some trouble because he was narrating a hadith that said that Muhammad was not buried until after his abdomen became bloated and his little finger bent, another detail that you may recognize from the Christian polemical sources. At this time, al-Uthmani, who was in charge, he imprisoned Waqi and ordered his execution and the exposure of his body. So not just his death, but his exposure, which is the traditional punishment for slandering Muhammad. However, other scholars came to Waki's rescue, and they persuaded al-Uthmani to release him. Waki learns that there's a mob plot to take justice into their own hand, not unlike what we see today, the people taking justice into their own hands when the court doesn't give them the verdict they wanted. And he avoids death by taking a different route back to his house, avoiding the mob that wanted to execute him. And despite all this, despite this ordeal, he continues to recite the offensive hadith later in his life. In one version of this tale, the following explanation is given. Waki argued that several companions of the Prophet said the messenger of God did not die, and God wished to show them the sign of death. That's why this hadith exists, because it wanted to prove the people saying that Muhammad did not die were wrong. So what this suggests to me is that around the year 800, the scholarly class still believed that Muhammad had an ordinary death, which is actually consistent with what the Quran teaches and most likely reflects the oldest Muslim tradition about Muhammad's end. However, at this time, the populace was uncomfortable with this. They were thought that this was insulting to Muhammad, and they probably, to some degree, were directly responding to Christian polemics. Christians saying that your prophet is a false prophet because he claimed that he would resurrect, and instead his body was left around until it began to stink. So they started to get this different idea. They started to come to the idea that Muslims believe today, that the body of prophets are preserved. And this is consistent with the development of Muslim doctrine in general. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is the idea that Muhammad worked miracles. You look at the Quran, it says over and over again that Muhammad could work no miracles. His only miracle is the Quran. We're not giving him any signs because people won't believe signs anyway. Well, in the Christian polemical sources, one of the most common attacks on Muhammad is he had no authenticating signs. The prophets worked signs to authenticate their message. Jesus especially worked signs and wonders. And what happens? Well, in the later hadith, especially in the later Sirah, all of a sudden, Muhammad's this great miracle worker who's working all kinds of miracles. The Quran was too established. They couldn't change the Quran. They had to leave the words in the Quran. But they developed this idea that Muhammad was working miracles and just ignored that it was incompatible with what the Quran said. So we can see pretty clearly that Islam developed in response to Christian polemics. Islam changed its core beliefs to avoid polemical attacks, to avoid evidence against the truth of Islam. So to sum up what we saw in this polemical section, and then I'll briefly give my reconstruction of what may have happened. But to summarize, the polemics are not fantasy writing. Polemics are not made up nonsense, created whole cloth. Rather, the polemical writings are based on Islamic sources. The hadith that are no longer accepted and other Islamic texts such as the biography of Ibn Ishaq, they demonstrate that Christian polemics were not invented, that they took Muslim stories, they may have slightly altered them, but the core ideas were the same. They were using what Muslims believed. They believed that Muhammad had an ordinary death, that he was an ordinary human being, just like anyone else. And they were using this as proof that he couldn't be a prophet. The early Islamic tradition was probably consistent with what the Quran claims. And the Quran was too difficult to change, so it didn't get changed. It didn't get altered over time, unlike the Hadith, which were changed to get rid of the earlier tale of Muhammad dying an ordinary death. Al-Kindi especially has been proven to draw from Hadith, directly word for word draw from it. We have the benefit of Al-Kindi being written in Arabic, so we can more easily see direct correspondence. And this particular work contains all the details of the polemic except for the dogs being eaten by, the dogs eating the body of Muhammad. But even this detail is not improbable, and it's found in the Kashim document, which is of exceptional quality and, remember, is said to derive from a Muslim eyewitness who was converted to Christianity. So in one sentence conclusion here before I give my reconstruction of history, it's far easier to see how the standard narrative, that is the narrative that many Muslims believe today, how this arose in an attempt to make Muhammad look better than to explain why Muslims suddenly added isnad chains to stories that actually were invented by Christian authors. That they took these stories that were supposedly only found in Christian polemics, and they made them into hadith that were at least acceptable at that time. So it seems to me to be extremely more likely that Muslims changed their story in response to Christian polemics than that Christians made up these stories and Muslims started to repeat them. Before I give my final summary, any thoughts you'd like to add, Bob?
I'm going to let you present your final story, and then I'm going to reply. I've got
Excellent.
a meeting at 9. I'm just going to let them know that I'm not going to be able to make it because of this live stream. I don't want to end this very quickly because I found this a very convincing argument. I mean, a really convincing argument. I was coming in quite skeptical. I was expecting a sort of an incoherent historical argument as I've kind of looked at some of the polemics made along the historical lines that but you seem to have pulled in a lot of sources and pulled out the thing that they all seem to have in common, which I find a very convincing
excellent.
A very convincing point.
Just take 3 to 5 minutes for me to give my summary, but I'm free to stay as long as you like. So if you want to go beyond 9 o'clock, that'd be great by me. So my reconstruction here, and I've kind of taken to put this in Islamic terms here, the text in black, this is what I would say is Sahih, that it's about as reliable as anything from history can be. About it, you can never know with absolute 100% certainty what happened in the past, but I feel that certain details are virtually certain from a historical perspective. And then the things in blue are the things that I consider probable, that they would be considered good enough to put in a history book, or in Muslim terms, the Hassan aspects of the tale. And then a few things I put in gold here are uncertain details. They're kind of like 50-50 in my mind about whether they actually occurred that way. And these would be the equivalent of da'if narrations. Not that they're false, they're not fabricated hadiths. They're just things that we can't determine whether they're true one way or another. So in my reconstruction here, in the year 634 or perhaps 635, Muhammad died a fairly ordinary death, most likely from an ordinary illness, and probably in the Syria or Palestine region. During his lifetime, Muhammad had preached that the end times were imminent. We didn't directly cover that today, but I have good reason to believe that. And that possibly he believed his own death would set in motion the end times. In congruence with him predicting that the end times were imminent and his death playing a role in that, he predicted his own resurrection or ascension, either 3 days or 40 days, or most likely he made different claims on different occasions. Just like the Quran at one place says, bring a surah like it, and another place says, bring 10 surahs like it. He changed his mind from time to time. He wasn't sure if it would take 3 days for him to resurrect like Jesus, or if it would take 40 days for him to return like Moses. And because of this, because he expected the end times to be upon people, because he expected to resurrect, he didn't appoint a successor. Muhammad's followers consisted both of people who actually believed in his religious message and people who had simply joined for a political or military cause. And that probably the people who were more interested in the political or military benefits formed the majority. And as I'm about to say, this is what caused all the chaos when Muhammad died. That there was those who were looking for riches and power, and they saw his death as their opportunity to seize control. They wasted no time pursuing that aim. So they started arguing with one another. I should be the rightful successor. No, I should be the rightful successor of Muhammad. And this faction is represented by Abu Bakr in the standard narrative. These are the people that are like, yes, Muhammad died. Get over it. We're going to continue our military pursuits because this is what he instructed us to do. These were his final marching orders for us. Were to go and enslave, to kick all the non-Muslims out of Arabia and go and conquer lands in the name of Allah. However, those who believed in the religious message of Muhammad, they responded in anger. They said that Muhammad wasn't really dead and that he would return as promised and that he would exert vengeance on those who said otherwise. And this is represented by Umar in the standard narrative. Muhammad's body was probably locked up while people debated, why some people debated and why other people waited to see if he would resurrect as they expected him to. But after a couple days, it became obvious that Muhammad's body was decomposing. Hot desert environment, the corpse was quickly rotting, and he was very hastily buried. Likely this was done in the middle of the night. They didn't want to have a proper funeral because they didn't want more people to come and see that his body was decaying. They didn't want to cause further damage to the community than the divisions that were arising already were causing. Because of this hasty burial, Muhammad's body was then able to be dug up by wild dogs and partially devoured, possibly only leaving his foot behind, like in that one hadith where they found a foot and they thought it was Muhammad's foot. Of the details, this is the least historically certain, but there's nothing particularly improbable about it. It's just, it's hard to say one way or another what happened to his body. The cover-up was only partially successful, and there was widespread apostasy, as it became clear that Muhammad was indeed a false prophet. However, the military leaders were in the majority, like I stated, and they were quickly able to bring the rebels in line. This would be what Islamic history describes as the Ridda Wars.
Which, for those of you that... Oh, sorry, you're just about to say it.
I was going to say the wars of apostasy, but if you want to add something, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's a well-accepted fact that after Muhammad's death, there was a civil war amongst the Muslims as huge sections of the early Muslim community abandoned Islam as they understood it, or rather abandoned the Islam of the new caliphs. They understood Islam in a different way, but we'll come into that maybe as I come back to
Absolutely. So how did Islam survive in this? Well, partially it survived because the majority weren't really believers in his religious message to begin with. They're just using it as an opportunity to wage war and get stuff for themselves. So the promise to resurrect was able to be overlooked and reinterpreted. The earliest tradition records that Muhammad had an ordinary death in line with him only being a warner. So they kind of just ignored this promise to resurrect, and they looked to all the times that he said he was just a warner, that he was an ordinary human being, that he was nothing special, and then they said that this is consistent with the message of Muhammad. Christian polemicists discovered the Islamic sources, and they took advantage of the tradition. They argued that Muhammad's death proved him to be a false prophet, based on their own traditions of saints' bodies defying natural decay. Not a Christian belief today, generally speaking, but it was a popular belief in medieval times that the bodies of saints did not decay, or at least temporarily avoided decay. By the time of the Abbasid revolution, there was a competing tradition that was beginning to emerge about Muhammad's body likewise defying the natural order, that it was not decaying, because that's what Christians are claiming happens to saints. Well, that's what Muslims are going to start claiming about what happens to Muhammad, even though this was originally foreign to their own way of thinking. But even though the populace, the uneducated people, were developing these ideas, the educated people, the people passing on the Hadith tradition, the people writing the biographies, they continue to support this older, only a worn, decaying body tradition, which is why it managed to survive in sources that are no longer considered authentic to our day. As part of these broad changes made by the Abbasids, the timing of Muhammad's death was moved up a couple years. Perhaps their primary motive was to put his death in the Hijaz instead of in the Syria-Palestine region, but it also provided them with this opportunity to clean up some of the details. They wanted to place Muhammad's death in their own region because they wanted to be claimed to be the rightful successors. They wanted to be claimed to be the rightful rulers of the Islamic Empire. But because of this developing tradition about Muhammad, having a supernatural death, if you like, the traditional account was being replaced by legend. And then they ordered they sponsored Ibn Ishaq writing a new biography to kind of clear things up. And this sealed the fate, ultimately, of the older tradition about Muhammad dying an ordinary death. This became, this work was highly successful, was highly read by Muslims, and they began to think of this alone as the authentic history, rather than these competing traditions of some people saying he had a supernatural death and some people saying he had an ordinary death. Finally, Muhammad's death was associated with the Khaybar poisoning story. This may have been done to make him a martyr, or it may have been just done as an excuse to move his death back. If everyone knew that he died in battle, and people still had an idea that the battles were taking place in Syria, it'd be difficult to move the date and location of his death, so they made up this story about the Khaybar poisoning. The Khaybar story itself was almost certainly invented wholesale. Most likely this was done for political reasons, because while the early Muslims were not necessarily super hostile to Jewish people, as indicated by those early Jewish sources where they saw them as being an aid, even if they didn't see Muhammad as a prophet, they saw the Muslim armies as being an aid serving their own purposes. But by the time the story was invented, it had become a priority to disassociate with Judaism, to make a hard break. And I think that probably the founding of Islam is more closely tied to Judaism than Christianity, actually, that Muhammad viewed himself as a figure in the line of Jewish prophets. He viewed himself, he was definitely not a literate, uneducated person. He had some connection to rabbinic tradition, which is why so many rabbinic sources make their way into the Quran. He was probably viewed as heretical, but he had a Jewish-esque background. The story of Muhammad has continued to evolve, primarily in these early years in response to Christian polemics. This necessitated the creation of numerous hadith to prove that these fabricated stories, these new ideas about who Muhammad was, they needed to invent hadith, and that's exactly what they did. Just like they invented miracles for Muhammad, they invented a different story around his death.
Can I just point out? Sorry, I just want to jump in and point out that we see something similar in our own time. So Christians have massively embarrassed Muslims on the whole paedophilia. You married a 6-year-old child. How could a 6-year-old ever consent? And then had sex with a 9-year-old child because she bled so she can breed, kind of mentality. And what we see in our modern age is that you've got Muslim apologists who have kind of lost the argument, I think. But Muslim apologists have tried to reinvent the story to say that Aisha was 18 and you have that apologetics. Now, imagine that process happened in a time where people couldn't just go on the internet and go and check the hadiths for themselves. And you know, you can well believe that if this kind of debate had happened, you know, back in the early days of Islam, which it didn't, because everybody was stupid and having sex with kids in those days, including Christians and Jews, that 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 we could have now inherited a very different understanding of when Muhammad married Aisha. So we kind of see that this massaging of history happening even now under pressure from Christian polemic. So why wouldn't it have happened 1400 years ago? But It would have been far easier to rewrite stuff 1400 years ago than it is today.
Exactly. You know, another example of this happening is that for years Muslims went around claiming that the Quran is perfectly preserved, and you know, some are still claiming that. This isn't, but since it's not necessarily, you know, a doctrinal point, at least as far as the Quran itself claiming, other Muslims are now starting to say, yes, we always knew that there was variance. We always knew that there was different versions of the Quran. You're not telling us anything that our own tradition didn't teach us. So we can see how their argument changes into what is most useful.
Or another example of that would be that for centuries Muslims said, oh, Jesus wasn't crucified on the cross. But in recent days, because Ahmadiyyat, they've popularized a new argument, which is that actually, yeah, it was Jesus that was crucified on the cross, but he just didn't die, you know. And so we've got example after example after example, like the fact that they keep finding Muhammad in different passages, then the Christians knock it down, and then that passage gets forgotten and a new passage gets discovered, you know, and it's always changing which passage is talking about Muhammad. So each time Christians press Islam critically on something, the narrative within Islam begins to morph. And we've got examples of that have been documented on video and documented through modern polemics and apologetics. So why didn't that happen 1400 years ago, especially when the Christians were launching these polemics against early Islam? But how much easier it would have been to rewrite things back in those days when one part of the world couldn't speak to another part of the world, or that you had one authoritative or body with a huge empire dictating what everyone's going to say and constantly trying to destroy any information that's different.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I'll let you finish.
Yep. So no, that is a perfect segue into my final thought here, that this evolution has continued to the present day, to the point where the Muhammad of Btbsoco is unrecognizable to most modern Muslims. The evolution of Islam didn't stop with the writing of the Hadith and whatnot. This is very ironic because I think that work was probably designed as propaganda to begin with, to improve the image of the historical Muhammad, at least from the picture of that time period. And this is the takeaway I want Muslims to think about. Does it really change Islam if Muhammad died a couple years later and he died an ordinary death and his body was stinking and people thought that he was going to resurrect and he didn't?
And he died in
Not
Syria.
necessarily by itself, but think about what this shows about the reliability of your history in general. I've demonstrated, I think, pretty definitively that some things about Muhammad's death have been altered. But what does that mean about the rest of your history? What else has been altered? What else was changed to get around Christian arguments against Islam being false? And I suspect that there's going to be a lot of examples. The more we dig into this, the more we're going to see examples like this, and like the creation of miracles, and like the changing of how Jesus died, where Muslims are forced to change their doctrine to get around arguments proving their doctrine's false.
Yeah. I mean, and just another example of the same, for 1400 years, Muslims were quite happy to quote their Quran when it says, say not three, for Allah is one God, as a rebuke against the Trinity. Then Christians pointed out, well, we've never believed in three gods. And suddenly it's like, oh, that verse wasn't talking about you. We were not talking about you, Christians. We were talking about these other people that believed in three gods, you know. And it's just kind of like you're making this up as you go along from generation to generation, aren't you? And I think is that the end of your presentation?
Yeah, that's the end of my slides there. But I think that the picture of Muhammad, the picture of Islam, has changed several times. You got the proto-Islam, which is represented by the Quran, that was too difficult to change. Then you kind of got the second or third version of Islam, which is represented by the biography of Ibn Ashaq, or Ibn Hassan if you prefer. And the Muslims have to reject that today because they say it's not reliable. So the third picture is painted by the Hadith and the Sirah literature. And today, a fourth version of Islam is arising, or a fifth version of Islam is arising, where people are now saying the Sahih Hadith, those aren't reliable either. We need to get rid of those sources. So Islam has continually changed. It's, as I like to put it, 14 centuries of bid'ah, 14 centuries of forbidden innovation, because they were proven false over and over again, and they just kept changing things to get around that.
Yeah, and that's definitely something we're seeing in our time, and we want to bear witness to some future historian who looks back on this in 200 years. This video is proof that we, in our lifetime, are experiencing Muslims reworking Islam. Hadiths that are Sahih are not Sahih anymore. The Quran that was never changed has always lived in a plurality of states, and we're experiencing that right now. So to you, future historian that watches this video, that is our testimony from our generation. So just to sort of give my comments to your presentation, because I've never really dug into yet, because I haven't had the time, the sort of historical critique that people like yourself, Lloyd, J. Smith, and others are pushing, Sneakers Corner and that lot. I had Sneakers Corner on once to sort of give me, to try and do a change my mind moment. And, he didn't, but he gave his presentation, and I wasn't particularly convinced by that. But but I think that you're on to something in terms of the fact that purely because of the sheer weight, distribution, and diversity of the evidence that is all corresponding around a certain motif around Muhammad's death, and around the fact that Muhammad led armies into Syria. And I really think that, if you think about it as a historian, in the same way that I invite people to do when we think about the resurrection, if I'm consistent and I think about this question of Muhammad's death and where he died and what he did in his life, you can't argue against such wide, diverse, independent, early, distributed evidence that Muhammad conquered Syria. And that really throws open the question about Islamic history as we keep getting told that it is. And it pays creed to the argument that I think is emerging in the historical critique that Muhammad, whether that be a title or whether that be a name, is a question, was a great military leader who conquered huge empires, conquered huge territories from empires. And, in those days, that's not a criticism so much, but Christians made that into a criticism. We saw that as a criticism as Christians, that a prophet comes with a sword to conquer. So it's, and it makes him out that he was a warlord in the first instance, primarily a warlord, which is the fundamental criticism that Christians threw at Muhammad. You know, he came with a song, he came with a sword, he came to conquer. But he was, other than that, a very ordinary figure who possibly had some kind of inspiration from, let's call it, a broad sort of an Abrahamic, like his own version of an Abrahamic religion, that he, because of his travels as a trader, because of his encounters with Jews particularly, had an understanding of some Abrahamic faith that he didn't really get a proper grasp on, and he'd pull stories in from his travels that he'd remembered from all of his journeys. And along with just being a great military leader that conquered all these territories, many of whom the minorities and subjugated peoples of those territories initially thought, oh, this is a relief, you know. And for geopolitical reasons, those first conquerors would have needed to be light-handed because they wouldn't want to be fighting on the borders to extend their empire and then dealing with rebels in their land. And this is just a geopolitical reality of any conqueror. When you initially conquer, you want to win over the newly conquered people, so you're initially quite light-handed. And it's only when you feel safe that you then begin to transform. The Romans did it. Why wouldn't anyone else? And it seems to me that this really blows a hole in the historical narrative as given by Muslims, which then obviously, as you've quite landed well, is that question of what else has been changed. I mean, if we're evidencing evidence of morphing in our generation, what was happening 1400 years ago? And I think we really can't underpin enough the transition from Umayyad to Abbasid empires, because that was the result of one group overthrowing another group. And that overthrow had to be legitimized, but it had to be legitimized within the paradigm of this prevalent religion. But this prevalent, and so it morphed it. And Muslims themselves will admit that between the Umayyad and the Abbasid, there were huge numbers of hadiths being created to delegitimize one group and legitimize the other group. And so hadiths were constantly being invented to legitimize political power and authority. So I think that it's a very good thesis. I think it was well evidenced. I think some of the details, you know, I would quibble with. I might fight about some of the details. And I think, I mean, I do think one of the problems that we face is really all we can paint history in is in the broad stroke. We can't paint it in the detail. Particularly this history that was so hotly contested for political reasons. The thing about Jesus is he was a nobody. The only people that cared about his history were the people that knew him and loved him. But Muhammad, his history is politicized from the very beginning. And that means that the politics has informed its history. And we all know that history is written by the victors, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you're the church. In which case, we started off, we wrote the history as we were being persecuted. Now, I've got a couple of questions, not many. So we've got the scene that Muhammad's body was locked up. Mm-hmm. Now, where do you see that scene as happening? Are you seeing that scene as happening in Mecca?
No, I think that it was probably in Syria, most likely.
You think it happened in a house in Syria?
Yeah, I think that, you know, it's probably where he was staying at that time. He probably had established himself as, I don't want to say a king because they wouldn't have had enough control over the land for that, but, you know, the ruling authority of the area, and he probably had a stable base of operations.
Right. So my next question then would be, when do you think the devotion to a tomb in Medina started? And B, why do you think a devotion in a tomb in Medina started? Because it is normative that, you know, where the great leader dies and he's buried, that just becomes their tomb. So, you know, historically, you would expect it if he died in Syria, that the tomb would be in Syria and people would venerate a tomb in Syria. Because after all, he's still this great conqueror.
Yeah, and that's a fair point for sure. That would definitely be a weakness. I would say that the change was made during the time of the Abbasid Revolution, but there still needs to be some sort of explanation how they got rid of the old gravesite. Creating a new one, that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, they could just make up a site, and if you convince enough people to go there, I mean, from a benign perspective, just look at the two competing theories about where Jesus was buried. It doesn't, the garden tomb being a
Yeah, but they're
fairly
both in Jerusalem, bro. I mean, there's
yeah,
a huge difference
I
between
know.
Syria and Medina.
But I'm just using it as an illustration that it isn't that hard to convince people to venerate a new site. But what it would be hard is to convince people not to venerate the old site. So, one possibility is that, Muhammad didn't have a marked grave, that they just buried the body somewhere and moved on. That, during the conquest, so the armies were moving on and they just buried the body, put some stones on it, whatever, and that people didn't necessarily really remember where it was. That's one possibility.
I mean, I have my own thoughts because I do find your argument convincing. But as I was listening to it, I was thinking about my own question, and I suspect, you know, that perhaps this warlord that is titled Muhammad or named Muhammad, as he knew his life was ending, like many, like many military leaders do, they go back to where they feel most safe or most secure. They want to go home. And I wonder if actually Muhammad, as a leader, kind of knew he was on his deathbed, knew he was dying, a bit like Alexander the Great wanted to go back to where he felt was home. So actually Muhammad maybe got back to Saudi Arabia and actually did die in Saudi Arabia, even after,
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. I hadn't considered that possibility, but if he was actually from Medina, then it would make sense that he would want to go back there.
Yeah. I mean, how does your argument play off? I'll be honest, and I haven't fully followed Jay Smith's argument, Dr. Jay Smith's argument, because he tries to, the book, the man, and the place, and he tries to argue that, Mecca is a recent city that, following Dan Gibson saying that Mecca wasn't the focal point of early Islam. How does your argument either contradict, contrast, synergize, or complement those kinds
Yeah,
of cases?
so that is a complex question. Let me just start by saying I don't have nearly as radical or revisionary view of Islamic history as Jay does. I wouldn't necessarily say it's completely incompatible, although Jay might feel otherwise since he doesn't think that Muhammad existed at all. I wouldn't say that's necessarily incompatible with, moving the original location of Mecca to Petra. I would say that it's just a unrelated argument. So it neither enhances nor detracts from that particular aspect of it. Now, the more radical view where Muhammad had nothing to do with the founding of Islam, and there was no such figure, there was no Islam in any form in the 7th century, that it was a later creation projected back onto the 7th century. Well, that obviously is not at all compatible with my idea, because I'm making an argument about generally, vague is probably not the right word, but generally, I'm not saying exact date, but generally when Muhammad died and generally the activities that he had in the last years of his life, which suggests that there is at minimum a Islamic military at this time. Maybe the spiritual message they're following doesn't have a lot to do with modern Islam. I could agree with that. But I can't agree with the more radical theory that it's a complete invention, that they just took a Syriac Christian text and made that into the Quran, and this was done, 100 years after the purported life of Muhammad, or whatever exact date they would put on it.
I'm just going to, by the way, give a right of reply to anyone that takes offense at Thaddeus's comment. If you'd like to come onto my show and make your case, you're more than welcome to. Though I tend to agree with Thaddeus, but I'm open to having my mind changed. I came into this not really having an opinion. By default, I was quite willing to just go along with the standard Islamic narrative. That Muhammad didn't lead armies into Syria, but I'm certainly won over to the point that he probably did now, based on this. And I'll obviously have to go and look into it some more. One of the interesting points that I got from this was that the fact that, and it's something I think we've given plenty of corresponding modern examples to, this idea of Islam morphing under the pressure of Christian polemic. And the fact that you've demonstrated that Christian polemics obviously were being filtered through a Christian paradigm, but they were really using Islamic sources, just like we attempt to use Islamic sources today. Why wouldn't that have happened 1400 years ago? We know John of Damascus was definitely using Islamic sources to make his arguments and observations about Islam. So why wouldn't have other Christians also done that? They were educated people, they were literate people, and Christianity has always had this idea of trying to win the argument per se, right from the early church fathers, the apologists back in the Roman classical world. They were doing it in the 1st and the 2nd century. Why would they stop in the 7th when they suddenly are now fighting an Islamic empire rather than a Roman one? But what I found really interesting was, again, the fact that they were touching into early strata of Islamic literature that has now been disparaged and has now been sort of hidden in plain sight by saying these are daif. And it does make me wonder how much of the Sahih Daif range was affected by Christian polemics down through the years and the felt criticism of the early Muslim community, and how that also helped to modulate their beliefs. I think that's a really interesting point. I think one thing that could really strengthen your argument is, and it's something I'm beginning to learn myself, I've started studying it, is learning about these so-called hadith sciences that are so scientific they can't agree what's sahih. It's so precise, it's a science, but it's such a science that no one can actually agree about what's a sahih hadith, what sort of ranges. And I think Christians really need, particularly Christian apologists like you and I, and anyone who's doing evangelism to Muslims, needs to be much more acutely aware of the fact that Muslims have different hadith collections, Shia and Sunni, and that they fundamentally disagree about what's acceptable hadiths, and they fundamentally disagree. And the science itself is just very questionable. Like, one of the ideas is that if two people lived at the same time and went into the same town, or could be identified as being in the same town, it was assumed that they had met. It's not proven that they are met. It's assumed that they had met. It's also really interesting, it's interesting that you've got things like, Bukhari was considered a deviant in his own lifetime. And his literature, his Sahih al-collection, Bukhari collection, didn't become the big thing that it is now in Islam until 100 years or more after his death. And it came through students. There are different versions of it, and the one that's most commonly used had to be corrected and revised. And lots of people don't know this. Lots of Muslims don't know this. you know. Um, and there's so much to learn, but this science, they just try to blind you with the science, literally. They literally try to blind you with the science. But it's not anything like the Muslim salesman would have you believe. It's nothing like as secure as they think that it is. It really is just a list of names, stick a story on top. And then once you've got a list of names that you know have established, remember all this happened over 1,000 years ago. Once you know which list of names is established, well, you can stick any story on the top of that name, and boom.
Exactly. And, this is what objective historians think probably actually happened, that once a chain was developed as Sahih, people just went back to it over and over again. Whatever story they wanted to say is good, they're like, oh, well, this chain's chested, I'll just stick the same chain on it.
Yeah. Anyway, any other? Go on.
So your point is very good though about hadith science, that the hadith collections, at least nominally, were compiled 250, 300 years after the time of Muhammad. But then the texts that they go to judge the reliability of these collections, they come hundreds of years after that. And they're supposed biographies of, the people in the chains. But what is the basis for that? I mean, anyone could just make up this biography. Well, we need so-and-so to be reliable. Oh, well, so-and-so was known for his excellent memory and that kind of thing.
How do we test that? How do we measure someone's excellent memory? And a lot of these isnad chains are literally just someone says, yeah, he was reliable witness. And it's kind of like they there's no evidence of their reliability, and some of the names are just like, it's just a name. Muhammad, which Muhammad?
Right.
It's really not anything like the Muslim salesman would have you believe it is. But unfortunately, lots of people get blinded by the science, i.e., they have so many categories thrown at them and so many one-liner stuff. And the Muslim salesman is relying on the 99-1 rule, that 99 people will just go, oh yeah, that's amazing because you made it sound amazing. But only one person will actually go and bother to check if anything the salesman is saying is true.
Yeah, and especially when they try to tie this to the Gospels or the New Testament literature, and they'll be like, oh, our literature has this long chain proving its reliability, and you don't know who wrote the Gospel of John. And well, I'm like, well, you know what the chain of narration for the Gospel of John is? Here it is. John.
No, it's like, we don't need a chain, bro. The chain's like one, oh gosh, yeah. It's always funny that they don't get that, but it's also a false logic, isn't it? Just because it's not more true because lots of people had to remember it. It doesn't become more true for that reason, and nor does it become less true even if you don't know who wrote it. Someone can write something anonymously and it be completely true. I mean, I don't know if they still do it today, but encyclopedias used to be written anonymously, but they were considered factual books.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, there is not one historian in the world who considers a chain of narration as part of their evaluation of the reliability of a particular source. That's just not something they look at, because any historian knows that the chain can be made up just as easily as anything else. Plus, even the principle of the chain kind of reduces the reliability to begin with, because even if the chain was real, you're relying on 10 generations of oral knowledge as opposed to a written text. And
as Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is the Muslim salesman's favorite scholar, would say, you can't rely on oral transmission. He would argue that, so why don't you be consistent, guys, and just apply his you love to quote him, why don't you apply that quote to your own religion?
Yeah, exactly. Even if we're talking about someone with an excellent memory, they're still more likely to misremember things than a text is. The text definitely isn't going to change. The only possibility is it'll survive or it won't survive, but it can't be changed, or at least not changed in a way that makes it not obvious it was changed. I mean, you could scribble out a word and write a different word, I suppose, but you would know that a change took place. Whereas someone's memory, you have no idea if it took place. And they don't have to be fraudulent. They probably legitimately think they're repeating exactly the same things, but, there's been subtle changes.
Yeah, and I think also the explosion of hadiths as you go forward in history, it goes like that. You know, it's kind of like that. That also is quite telling of something.
Yeah, it's also, an inverse of the way history actually works. The farther you get from the time of the events, the more information you have
Yes,
about.
and the more accurate it is, the whole science of hadiths is ultimately an admission that Islamic history was invented, and that competing Muslims invented different histories to compete with their particular views on things. And actually, I think the proto-Islam, much like you, my thought is that a proto-Islam of Muhammad was changed quite radically about 200 years later, and that is the fossilized Islam that becomes classical Islam for the most part, with some waxing and waning there. Anyway, we have been going for 2 hours and a half, and I need to eat.
Yep.
So I'm going to stop.
Sounds good. If I could just give one final thought
Yeah, of course.
here. That, I've outlined information about the death of Muhammad. And the purpose is, well, one, it is an interesting topic. It is interesting to look at something and see what we can learn about history. But the broader picture here is to say that Islam has been changed, kind of as we've been talking about afterwards here, that there is no standard narrative, really. There's just the narrative that has been chosen to be pushed by the leaders of the Sunnis. There's a different narrative pushed by the Shia, and there's different narratives when you look back in time. And that's true of the death of Muhammad, but it's true of lots of other things as well. I think the lesson is we shouldn't just take things for granted. It's easy. It is often easy to just say, even if everything that Muslims claim is true, Islam is still false because, it has all these horrible moral teachings. It contradicts the Bible. It declares that Jesus was not crucified, which is one of the most certain facts of all of history, and so on and so forth. And that has value, and that is good. But we can go deeper. We can destroy the foundation of Islam. Someone can convince themselves that whatever repugnant moral teachings they find in Islam must be good because they must come from Allah. And what I always try to challenge Muslims to do when they come and comment on my channels is I say, what is your evidence for that? What is your evidence that this is true? I thank you for sharing what your beliefs are, but what is your evidence? And this is why I got into Islam. I got into Islam because it is, on paper, a historical religion, just like Christianity is. I always thought that this was the defining characteristic not the defining character, poor choice of words, that this was a unique characteristic of Christianity, that it was a religion based on history, a religion that can be proven false. You prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, there is no Christianity. And Islam shares that in common, which is why I challenge Muslims to give evidence. If Buddhism wasn't founded when and where it was said to be founded, it doesn't actually matter because the founder isn't important. He is looked at as a wise teacher. He's looked at as great spiritual knowledge. But if it actually came from someone else, it's irrelevant. If Muhammad didn't actually bring Islam, if what people believe is Islam today is not what he taught, then Islam is false, because it is entirely based on his authority and the authority of the God that he was said to have received revelation from. If he has no authority, then the Quran has no authority either, because there's nothing to test the Quran on. You can only test the Quran on Muhammad. It doesn't really make historical claims. Unlike the Bible, that has a historical narrative from creation to revelation, there is no real historical narrative in the Quran. It refers to historical events, but it doesn't tell you when they happened. It doesn't give you anything that's testable. It just says, remember this event. Remember this event that you know from Christianity, that you know from the Bible, or you know from extra biblical sources. But it doesn't actually provide a chronology. It doesn't actually test it. You can only test Muhammad. And if Muhammad does not have the authority, if what Muhammad taught has been lost, if what Muhammad actually brought is no longer around, then there is no truth to Islam.
And I would just say and we know that there are sincere Muslims out there. Not everyone is a Dawagandist. Not everyone is a Salafist thug. There are good people in the Muslim community, and if you're one of those kind-hearted, warm, generous, family-valued, kind of centered Muslims who genuinely wants to seek after the truth, then you've got to understand what we're doing is we're trying to open your eyes to the fact that through no fault of your own, you may well have been deceived. And we want to encourage you to look again at Christ, but not look at Christ through the filters of dawah, not look at Christ through the filters of Islamic polemic, but look at Christ through what is found in the New Testament, the earliest possible source about Christ's life, and come to your own conclusions. We uphold Christ because he is the fulfillment of messianic prophecy in the Old Testament. We uphold Christ because he is the light of the world, the truest, best human being to follow. And we invite you to accept him as your Lord, your Savior, your God, and your King, and to join with his holy church in a holy mission to renew the earth. And that's why we do this. We're not doing it because we're motivated by hate. We're doing it for you, that sincere Muslim that is out there, who is a kind-hearted person, whose kind heart is possibly being distorted by a very bad, very, very bad Muhammad of the Hadiths. And with that, we will leave you with our prayers. I'm going to close in a prayer. Ascribe to the Lord, O sons of the mighty. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due to his name. Worship the Lord in holy array. The voice of the Lord is upon the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Yes, the Lord breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, and Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord hews out flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer to calve, and strips the forests bare. And in his might, in his temple, everything says, glory. The Lord sat as king at the flood. Yes, the Lord sits as king forever. The Lord will give strength to his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Good night, guys, and God bless.